January 1944. A rural siding outside Camp Concordia, Kansas. The steel doors of a troop train slide open, spilling cold air and the smell of coal smoke. Inside, rows of German prisoners. Wehrmacht, Afrika Korps, Luftwaffe crews squint at the blinding white of snow. Their boots crunch onto American soil for the first time. Armed guards wait, rifles slung but relaxed. Beyond the barbed wire fence, a water tower gleams in the morning sun. There's no shouting, no blows, only a sergeant calling names in calm English. They expect punishment, hunger, humiliation. Instead, they're handed hot coffee in tin mugs. A medic checks frostbite. A chaplain greets them with a nod. As the trucks roll toward the camp, the prisoners stare through slats, rows of neat wooden barracks, a baseball diamond, a mess hall chimney sending up the scent of bacon. One young soldier murmurs to another, "This can't be America. This must be heaven." Yet this strange paradise was not an accident. It was built by policy, law, and the peculiar balance of morality and war. By early 1943, the United States found itself in an unexpected position. Not just a global combatant, but also a vast warden. Across the Atlantic, German armies were surrendering by the tens of thousands in North Africa. Rommel's proud Afrika Korps, once the symbol of discipline and desert brilliance, was collapsing under Allied fire and starvation. When the campaign ended in May 1943, roughly 250,000 Axis prisoners were in Allied hands. The British Isles were already overcrowded with POWs. North Africa lacked the resources to house and feed them. So, under the combined logistics of the British and American war offices, convoys began crossing the Atlantic, not with troops, but with the men who had fought them. Cargo holds that once carried munitions from New York or Norfolk returned loaded with German prisoners bound for the American interior. It was a journey of silence and disbelief. For the first time, many Germans saw the scale of America's industrial war machine. Endless convoys, aircraft overhead, destroyers escorting them through waters that U-boats no longer ruled. When they disembarked at East Coast ports, Newport News, Norfolk, Boston, they were processed swiftly under the strict terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention. Each man was fingerprinted, deloused, issued new clothing marked PW, and given a serial number. They were no longer soldiers of the Reich. They were now property of the U.S. War Department's Prisoner of War Division. What awaited them was unlike anything in the war-torn Old World. From 1942 to 1946, America would hold nearly 425,000 German POWs in more than 500 camps scattered across 46 states. Camps rose in the open plains of Kansas and Nebraska, the pine forests of Mississippi, the deserts of Arizona, and the farmlands of Iowa and Texas. Each main camp functioned as a hub for dozens of smaller branch camps, often located near factories or farms desperate for labor. The contrast was stunning. In Europe, cities lay in rubble, food was rationed to crumbs, and civilians survived on fear. In the United States, even under wartime austerity, food flowed from fertile farms, and industry roared 24 hours a day. When the first groups arrived, U.S. officers knew that order, not cruelty, would keep these men productive and compliant. Every guard, every commandant operated under the War Department's directive. Treat them as you would wish your own men to be treated. This policy was neither sentimental nor naive. It was strategic. American soldiers were themselves being held in German camps, and Washington wanted reciprocity. Every Red Cross inspection, every humane photograph could serve as insurance for captured Americans. Still, the prisoners were startled. Their new environment was fenced, yes, but it was also clean, organized, and astonishingly fair. Inside the perimeters, barracks were built of timber, fitted with stoves, and arranged in neat grids. Water was running. Toilets flushed. Each camp had a hospital ward, a canteen, and a parade ground. At Camp Algona in Iowa, the POW's first task after arrival was to shave, wash, and eat. A full ration meal that rivaled what many Germans at home could only dream of. White bread, meat, vegetables, even dessert. Those who had endured the hunger of Tunisia or Sicily wept openly. One officer later recalled, "I could not believe that the enemy would feed us like this." Medical officers conducted full examinations. Tuberculosis, malaria, and malnutrition cases were treated without discrimination. Chaplains offered services in both languages. Translators explained the camp rules: no propaganda, no escape attempts, no violence among inmates. Punishments were administrative, rarely brutal. The fences, barbed and patrolled, defined boundaries but not oppression. At night, floodlights glowed softly across fields where crickets sang. To men conditioned for the brutality of the Eastern Front, this calm felt otherworldly. And beyond those fences, America itself seemed surreal. Locals sometimes drove by slowly, peering curiously at the men who had once bombed their allies or torpedoed their ships. A few waved. Some farmers nodded approvingly, already thinking of the labor they so badly needed. The war had created an unlikely intersection. Enemy soldiers landing not in dungeons, but in the open landscape of democratic abundance. In those first weeks, confusion lingered. But gradually, routine took hold. Bugles marked reveille. Roll calls echoed in clipped German. The scent of coffee drifted from the mess hall. Work details assembled. Guards exchanged brief words, and the day began with order. This was not mercy. It was discipline through structure. Yet to the prisoners, it felt like grace. Next came the realization that this temporary paradise was governed by international law, American efficiency, and moral calculation, an equation that would shape every hour of their captivity. Inside those American fences, the rhythms of military captivity soon solidified into a strange kind of normal life, one defined not by fear, but by structure. Every camp ran on Geneva Convention principles and War Department precision. Each prisoner received 3 full meals daily, roughly equal to a U.S. Army ration, about 3,200 calories of bread, meat, vegetables, and fruit. They were issued cigarettes, soap, and clothing. They could earn small credits by working, spend them in a camp canteen, and even subscribe to approved magazines. Red Cross trucks arrived regularly with parcels, chocolate, books, stationery. It was, in essence, the same system that governed U.S. soldiers, but mirrored behind barbed wire. Letters were allowed, censored for security but not destroyed. Many German POWs wrote home describing the miracle of their treatment. These letters astonished families in a starving Reich. Some were intercepted by Nazi censors, who branded them enemy propaganda. Yet the truth traveled, that America's prisoners were eating butter, playing soccer, and receiving medical checkups. But behind this civility lay cold strategy. Washington understood that morale could be a weapon. If German POWs were treated with discipline and dignity, they could be managed, even re-educated. They might also talk, quietly, willingly, about the Reich, the war, and their units. Information flowed more freely in comfort than in fear. Still, not every man inside those fences was ready to let go of Hitler's shadow. The U.S. military quickly realized that ideology was the camp's invisible front line. Commandants separated prisoners into categories: ardent Nazis, followers, and non-Nazis. Flags and salutes were banned, but secret cells still formed. In some camps, anti-Nazi prisoners were beaten or murdered by diehards trying to maintain control. One of the first such incidents occurred in 1943 at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, when 3 prisoners murdered a fellow German they accused of betraying the Reich. The U.S. Army responded with military trials and executions, underscoring that even paradise had its gallows, yet discipline held. The camps remained models of order compared to those in Europe. Inspectors from the International Red Cross routinely praised their sanitation, food quality, and adherence to international law. For the War Department, the camps served another purpose. They filled America's wartime labor gap. With millions of American men overseas, farms, factories, and lumber mills lacked hands. German POWs were the answer. Legally allowed under the Geneva Convention, provided the work was not directly military. By 1944, over 200,000 prisoners were laboring in U.S. agriculture and industry. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in Minnesota, chopped timber in Oregon, and canned fruit in California. They built roads, repaired levees, and even helped maintain army bases. Work detachments often lived in smaller branch camps, sometimes just tents beside a cornfield. Farmers recalled the men as efficient and polite. Many POWs, amazed by American generosity, began questioning the Nazi propaganda they'd grown up believing. In their off hours, they played soccer or chess, built furniture from scrap wood, and organized orchestras. At Camp Algona, prisoners built a detailed nativity scene, hand-carved from plaster, which stunned visiting Americans with its craftsmanship and faith. Education flourished, too. The War Department authorized courses in English, math, and political science. Some camps created universities led by captured officers and professors. A handful of prisoners even studied the U.S. Constitution. A strange irony, learning democracy while confined by it. Commandants encouraged these programs. The goal was to keep men busy, prevent unrest, and sow seeds for Germany's post-war reconstruction. By 1945, the POW camps had become miniature societies, self-governed, productive, and astonishingly peaceful. Outside the wire, Americans debated their existence. Newspapers occasionally criticized the luxury treatment of enemy soldiers, while U.S. families coped with rationing and loss. But officials defended it, citing both the Geneva Convention and the hope of reciprocal treatment for Americans held in Europe. For the men inside, however, the experience remained surreal. They had fought in deserts, jungles, and frozen trenches. Now they found themselves in a nation untouched by bombs, where trains ran on time, factories glowed at night, and civilians smiled. The shock of that contrast cut deep. Some called it hypocrisy, others revelation. To these prisoners, the barbed wire no longer symbolized punishment. It framed a vision of what civilization could be. And yet, this apparent paradise was fragile. Behind its calm exterior, rival ideologies and the weight of defeat simmered. What happened next would test whether humanity could truly survive captivity. Angle A. The human shock. For many captured Germans, the first and most powerful emotion in America wasn't fear, it was disbelief. The men who had marched across Europe in the name of racial superiority now found themselves treated with civility by the very nation their propaganda had mocked as decadent. The shock ran deep. Letters and diaries from the time reveal a consistent theme: the humiliation of kindness. At Camp Shelby, a captured panzer gunner wrote, "They hand us bread and coffee without spitting in it. They speak calmly, even smile. I feel smaller than I did in defeat." That contradiction, compassion from the enemy, forced reflection. Men who had believed in Nazi invincibility now watched American guards joke freely, eat the same food, and play baseball on weekends. The U.S. was not starving, not desperate. The prisoners saw a society confident in its abundance, and that realization, more than punishment, broke illusions. The war had told them they were fighting a barbaric, collapsing America. Instead, they encountered order and quiet pride. The human mind resists such dissonance. Some clung harder to ideology, others quietly surrendered to reality. That inner war, between pride and perception, defined every man behind the wire, and it would determine who changed and who refused to. Angle B. The tactical logic of abundance. Behind the seeming generosity of America's POW system lay cold, deliberate logic. The U.S. military understood that food, fairness, and order were strategic assets. Starved men revolt, respected men obey. By 1943, the War Department had built an entire bureaucratic infrastructure dedicated to prisoner management. The Provost Marshal General's Office, Prisoner of War Division. Manuals detailed everything, from the dimensions of a bunk bed to the number of potatoes per man per day. Commandants were rotated to avoid favoritism. Inspections were documented like factory reports. Every privilege had purpose. When prisoners ate U.S. Army rations, it wasn't sentiment. It was supply efficiency. Feeding POWs from existing chains avoided disruption. When prisoners were allowed sports, it wasn't leisure. It was control. A busy camp was a peaceful camp. Even education and entertainment had tactical value. The War Department knew that information spreads faster through conversation than interrogation. An officer who lectures on geography might reveal more than one under questioning. A choir singing German hymns under the watch of an interpreter was still producing signals, tone, and morale data. In war, efficiency is power. The U.S. simply applied that principle to humanity itself. Angle C. The ethics of law and image. Humanity also had a public dimension. Washington needed to show the world that it was fighting not only to win, but to remain civilized. The 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War became the moral compass of the entire system. Every camp had a posted copy, translated into German. Violations were documented and reported to the International Red Cross, which made regular visits. For the Roosevelt administration, this adherence was both ethical and symbolic. America's power was not just industrial, it was moral. Upholding the rules meant projecting the values of democracy against totalitarian cruelty. If the Nazis built camps of death, the Americans built camps of order. But there was another calculation. Thousands of U.S. airmen and soldiers were now POWs in Germany. By showcasing fairness, Washington hoped to guarantee reciprocal treatment. Each loaf of bread given to a German in Kansas might save an American in Stalag Luft III. Thus, every rule was part of a larger exchange of reputation and restraint. The Red Cross photographs of German POWs smiling over baseball games weren't propaganda alone. They were messages to the enemy. We are civilized. Are you? Still, not every American approved. Critics asked why their sons bled overseas while German prisoners received milk and dessert. Senators fielded angry letters. Radio hosts fanned resentment. Yet the War Department held its line. America will not become what it fights. That policy, costly, disciplined, principled, became the foundation of what the prisoners themselves would soon describe, almost in awe, as paradise. By the end of 1944, this strange system of moral warfare had achieved something unprecedented. It had turned enemies into manageable men. Yet, beneath the calm, the cracks of ideology and violence were widening. Inside the barracks, secret Nazi cells plotted control. In the fields, quiet bonds grew between prisoners and American civilians. Paradise was about to fracture, revealing not one truth, but 6 different realities of captivity. Angle D. Ideology. Behind barbed wire beneath the neat barracks and polite discipline, another war continued. A war of belief. Inside the camps, Nazi loyalists still saw themselves as soldiers of the Reich. They saluted secretly at night, whispered Hitler's name like prayer, and punished anyone who spoke against the Führer. In the early months, commandants underestimated the reach of this underground network. Hardline officers created camp hierarchies, enforcing ideological purity. Younger or apolitical men were coerced into obedience. A smile toward an American, a word of sympathy, even a shrug at propaganda could be labeled treason. Then the killings began. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, 1943, 3 POWs strangled fellow prisoner Johannes Kunze, accusing him of informing U.S. officers about Nazi activities. His body was found under the barracks floor. The murder stunned Washington. Trials followed. The perpetrators were executed by hanging, the first such U.S. military execution of foreign prisoners on home soil. After Tonkawa, the War Department moved swiftly. Hardliners were isolated in segregation camps like Alva, Oklahoma, or Fort Devens, Massachusetts. Yet even there, ideology burned. On the walls, some painted swastikas. Others held honor courts to enforce silence. But for many POWs, the violence broke the spell. They saw what blind loyalty had done, even among men now powerless and defeated. Letters from these camps began shifting in tone, no longer proud, but questioning. In confinement, The ideology that once united them began to eat itself alive. Angle E, labor and the American heartland. For most prisoners, daily survival meant work, and work meant America, its farms, its people, its ordinary rhythm. By mid-1944, the U.S. had integrated POW labor into the nation's wartime economy with astonishing efficiency. Over 2,000 branch camps operated under main bases, dispatching small groups to fields, factories, and forests. Prisoners rose before dawn, loaded onto trucks, and dispersed to civilian employers under guard. They harvested cotton in Texas, chopped sugarcane in Louisiana, and plucked apples in Washington state. Farmers paid the War Department a wage per worker, part of which was credited to the prisoner's account as camp currency. It was labor diplomacy, productive, lawful, and mutually beneficial. At first, contact with civilians was minimal, but as trust grew, rules relaxed. Guards sometimes set their rifles aside. Locals shared sandwiches or lemonade. Children waved to the Krauts, who in turn carved toys or sketched portraits in thanks. For many POWs, this was their first real glimpse of America, not through propaganda, but through its people. They saw women driving tractors, black laborers working alongside white, and towns where churches and schools stood unbombed. It was a cultural awakening that propaganda had never prepared them for. One prisoner later recalled, "The farmer's wife smiled at us. That moment did more to end my loyalty to Hitler than any defeat in Africa." Through work, the line between enemy and human blurred, and though the fences remained, something within began to shift. Angle F, culture, art, and the birth of reflection. As months turned into years, the POW camps became microcosms of a nation they barely knew. Boredom turned into creativity. Camps formed orchestras, theater troupes, art studios, and newspapers. At Camp Algona, Iowa, prisoners built the now famous Algona Nativity scene, a life-size display carved from plaster and wood, depicting not victory or vengeance, but peace. The project began quietly, a few men sculpting figures from cement sacks, but soon grew into a full artistic enterprise. When the scene was unveiled at Christmas 1944, Americans came from miles away to see it. Under the soft glow of lanterns, guards and prisoners stood together in silence. Elsewhere, the War Department launched an ambitious educational program known as the Special Projects Division. Captured teachers, engineers, and officers were encouraged to lecture on subjects from mathematics to civics. By 1945, more than 15,000 POWs were enrolled in what became unofficial universities behind wire. Through books and discussion, a slow metamorphosis began. Prisoners compared American democracy to the militarized obedience of their homeland. They debated freedom, accountability, and truth, ideas once dismissed as weakness. The result wasn't conversion overnight. It was erosion. Ideology faded through exposure, not argument. By the time the war neared its end, thousands of German POWs had seen more of America's moral and social system than most European civilians ever would. And in that exposure lay the seed of something history would remember long after the guns fell silent, a quiet respect for the nation that had captured them. The paradox deepened. Behind barbed wire, surrounded by armed guards, many Germans had discovered a freer world than the one they had left behind. But soon, the war itself would turn, and paradise would be tested by numbers, chaos, and the final collapse of the Reich. By late 1944, the trickle of prisoners became a flood. The Allied advance across France and Belgium brought the surrender of entire divisions. Train after train rolled into American ports, packed with dazed men from Normandy, the Ardennes, and the collapsing Western Front. The War Department scrambled to expand capacity. Existing camps overflowed. Fairgrounds, racetracks, and even unfinished airfields were converted into temporary holding sites. In the Midwest, new compounds rose almost overnight. Rows of barracks framed by barbed wire, each one a self-contained world of order and defeat. What began as a controlled humanitarian experiment was now a logistical storm. At its peak, America held nearly 372,000 German POWs simultaneously. Yet even under this strain, the system held. No famine, no epidemics, no massacres. The secret was discipline, and an extraordinary commitment to procedure. Commandants logged every bedroll, every ration, every hour of work. Red Cross inspectors moved constantly from camp to camp, recording conditions and interviewing prisoners. When shortages hit civilian shelves, POWs still received their allotted calories. To the Germans, it was unthinkable. At home, their families were living under bombing, starvation, and fear. Here, even as prisoners, they ate regularly and slept safely. The guilt of comfort became heavy. Among the guards and officers, however, new tensions grew. Many Americans had lost brothers or sons in Europe. Watching enemy soldiers eat heartily and play football tested their restraint. Yet most followed the rule of law with stoic professionalism. In this quiet discipline lay the moral backbone of the U.S. Army's prisoner system. But the war was changing, and so were the men inside. News filtered in through letters and radios. Allied armies were crossing the Rhine. Soviet troops were entering Berlin, and the Reich's end was near. Among the prisoners, emotions fractured. Some rejoiced privately, others descended into despair. In this psychological chaos, one of the War Department's most ambitious initiatives took root: the re-education program, known formally as the Special Projects Division. Led by intellectual officers fluent in German and psychology, the program sought to denazify prisoners not through coercion, but through exposure to truth. Camps received curated reading lists: the Federalist Papers, Lincoln's speeches, the Gettysburg Address, and reports on Nazi atrocities. Newsreels were screened showing bombed German cities, concentration camps, and civilian suffering. The goal was not humiliation, but awareness. To confront ideology with evidence, results varied. Some prisoners dismissed it all as Allied propaganda. Others sat in stunned silence. One diary entry from a Luftwaffe mechanic reads, "If even half of this is true, then we fought for monsters." The program's architects knew they were playing a long game. They called it reorientation, replacing fanaticism with critical thought. Every educated man who returned home disillusioned with Nazism was seen as a future building block for democracy. The process wasn't smooth. In some camps, the screenings triggered rage. In others, shame. Guards reported prisoners weeping openly. But even as minds shifted, another test loomed. One not of ideology, but of control. The sheer number of prisoners created cracks in security. With so many men, watchtowers could not cover every inch, and not every guard was alert. It was only a matter of time before someone tried to escape. In December 1944, that moment came in the Arizona desert. At Camp Papago Park, near Phoenix, a group of 25 German naval prisoners began tunneling beneath their barracks. For months they worked in secret, using tin cans and makeshift shovels, hiding sand in false walls and hollow logs. Their plan was meticulous: to reach the Salt River bed, follow it under moonlight, and reach Mexico. They were submariners, disciplined, patient, and daring. Their commander, Captain Jürgen Wattenberg, orchestrated the plan with precision. When the tunnel finally broke through the surface, they emerged into the cool desert night, free for the first time in years. The escape electrified the nation. Newspapers called it the German Great Escape. The FBI and Army launched a massive manhunt. But unlike the brutal reprisals seen in Europe, there was no mass punishment. The fugitives faced the elements: cold nights, cactus fields, and hunger. Locals spotted them stealing chickens, wandering aimlessly, and even asking directions in broken English. One pair surrendered at a roadside diner after politely ordering breakfast. Another group built a raft that collapsed in an irrigation canal. Within weeks, all were recaptured without a shot fired. When Captain Wattenberg was returned to camp, he saluted the commandant and said calmly, "It was our duty to try." The Americans agreed and returned him to his barracks without violence. The incident became legend. not for bloodshed, but for restraint. It symbolized a strange, mutual code of conduct between enemies who still respected rules, even in defiance. That December night in the desert marked the high point, and the breaking point, of the POW system's illusion of peace. As the war turned toward its end, both captors and captives faced the truth. The war might soon be over, but what came next would test their humanity more than ever. By the spring of 1945, the last act of the war unfolded, and with it, the final transformation of America's German POWs. Across the ocean, Germany was dying in slow motion. Entire cities were reduced to ash. Refugees fled west by the millions. Rumors reached the camps of Hitler in a bunker, of the Red Army's vengeance, of families scattered or dead. The prisoners, once disciplined and stoic, now lived in quiet turmoil. Each letter home arrived like a wound. "No reply from my mother," one wrote. "Our village is gone." For others, mail simply stopped. When VE Day came on May 8, 1945, there were no cheers behind the wire, only silence. The flags of the Reich were gone, its leaders dead or captured. Overnight, these men ceased to be soldiers. They were disarmed enemies without a country. And yet inside the camps, life went on. Breakfast at 6, roll call at 7, work details, sports, and classes continued, as if routine could hold back the chaos outside. But the meaning had changed. The guards and the prisoners now shared a strange bond, both waiting for what came next. For many Americans, VE Day was victory. For the prisoners, it was identity collapse. Some begged to stay in the U.S., terrified of returning to Soviet occupation zones. Others yearned for home, no matter what remained there. The U.S. military faced an immense logistical challenge, repatriating hundreds of thousands of POWs scattered across the continent. But the war wasn't entirely over. Japan still fought on, and Allied ships were still needed in the Pacific. Immediate return was impossible. So the prisoners stayed. For months after Germany's surrender, barbed wire still enclosed men who were no longer enemies. Boredom returned, followed by unrest. Without the structure of purpose, discipline frayed. Black markets appeared. Fights broke out. Some commandants feared riots. To restore morale, re-education intensified. Schools for democracy opened in dozens of camps, teaching civics, literature, and even American history. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, POWs read translations of the Bill of Rights. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, a series of lectures began titled The Roots of Freedom. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Men once sworn to Hitler now studying the principles of Jefferson. But there was another current at work, the slow acceptance of defeat. As Allied photographs of concentration camps reached the POWs, silence spread like fog. In one camp, the commandant screened film of Buchenwald. When the lights came up, no one spoke. A few walked out in tears. Others stood frozen, staring at the projector. An interpreter recalled, "They did not shout or deny. They simply looked older." This was the moment the illusion shattered. For years, the prisoners had defended the Reich as an idea of order and honor. Now, confronted with what that order had truly built, many broke inside. The re-education program no longer needed persuasion. Reality itself had become the teacher. And yet, amid this reckoning, the camps still produced glimpses of grace. In Texas, prisoners helped rebuild barns destroyed by storms. In Iowa, they volunteered to play concerts for local churches. In Kansas, they carved toys for American children at Christmas. One farmer later recalled, "They were boys again, not enemies." Even the U.S. Guards, hardened by years of service, began to see the men differently. Some friendships formed, tentative, quiet, but real. Guards slipped extra coffee or shared cigarettes. A few exchanged addresses, promising to write after the war. By mid-1945, a new classification emerged within the War Department: recovered Germans, not dangerous. These were men deemed politically reformed and ready for repatriation. But bureaucracy moved slower than compassion. The war's machinery, which had captured them with precision, struggled to set them free. It wasn't until late 1945 and into 1946 that ships finally began moving prisoners home. The journey back was colder, quieter. Gone were the cheers of victory, replaced by uncertain silence. They returned not to triumph, but to ruins, to a Germany split by occupation zones, hunger, and guilt. For many, America lingered like a dream, surreal, ordered, humane. Some would write years later that captivity in the U.S. had saved their sanity. Others never spoke of it, ashamed that their best meals of the war had come in enemy hands. A few even returned to America after the war, as immigrants, craftsmen, or farmers, rebuilding lives in the land that had once imprisoned them. The paradox of paradise had come full circle. The prisoners of war had learned freedom through captivity. But before they could truly go home, one final chapter remained. A reckoning of numbers, legacies, and memory that would define how history judged this strange, human experiment. The guns of Europe had fallen silent, but for the German POWs in America, the war's end brought neither closure nor freedom, only waiting. By the summer of 1945, more than 370,000 prisoners still lived behind U.S. fences. Trains that had once carried new arrivals from the ports now reversed their direction, beginning the colossal process of repatriation. It would take nearly 2 years before the last German soldier left American soil. Ships were scarce. Supply routes were still committed to the Pacific. Many POWs found themselves transferred from U.S. custody to British and French hands, not home, but to work camps in shattered Europe. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, they could be used for reconstruction, not punishment. For thousands, that distinction meant little. Instead of returning to their families, they were sent to repair railways, clear debris, or harvest crops for former enemies. At Le Havre, ships from America unloaded prisoners who thought they were finally free, only to be marched into labor compounds. For some, captivity extended until 1948. Those who remained temporarily in the United States faced a strange limbo. They were no longer enemies, yet not civilians, no longer soldiers, yet not citizens. Camp routines continued, lectures, work details, mail, but morale faded. News of Germany's devastation deepened the melancholy. Letters described hunger, chaos, and the division of the homeland. Some prisoners asked the War Department to delay their repatriation rather than face the ruins. Commandants tried to maintain order with routine and decency. The policy of humane treatment never wavered. The Red Cross continued inspections, documenting what would later be described as the most law-abiding POW system in modern history. The official U.S. Army death rate for German POWs was under 1%, a fraction of that seen in Europe or Asia. As men began to depart, camps closed in waves. Barracks were dismantled or sold to local communities. Many became housing for veterans or migrant workers. Some were left to rot, their watchtowers leaning into prairie wind. In towns across America, memories lingered. The polite strangers who had worked the fields, played music, or carved nativity figures. Not all recollections were kind. For families who had lost sons in battle, the sight of smiling prisoners had been a wound that never healed. Local newspapers occasionally printed bitter letters. Why were they given steak while my boy ate K-rations? Yet over time, bitterness softened into curiosity. Some farmers received postcards years later from former POWs thanking them for kindness and promising to return one day as free men. Meanwhile, in Washington, officials analyzed the results. Reports concluded that the POW program had been a complete success, a triumph of law, logistics, and discipline. The U.S. had demonstrated that mass imprisonment could coexist with humanity. Not one major riot, not one famine, and only a handful of successful escapes, but there was more than policy behind those numbers. The program had revealed something deeper about America itself, its faith in rules even amid hatred. Commandants who ran the camps later testified that their greatest weapon was fairness. "When you feed a man, you disarm him," one officer said. By late 1946, the last major ships departed New York and New Orleans. On board, men lined the rails, staring back at the skyline they had come to know from afar. For some, it symbolized captivity. For others, a strange kind of safety they might never find again. Behind them, the camps fell silent. Empty barracks, abandoned baseball fields, flags taken down. The great experiment of mercy was ending. And yet, even as the fences came down, their impact was just beginning. On memory, on morality, and on the men who had lived within them. When the ships finally reached Europe, the returning German POWs stepped onto a continent that no longer resembled the one they'd left. Their homes were bombed-out shells. Cities were rubble. Germany itself was divided, carved into occupation zones ruled by the Allies. For many, the return felt less like liberation than exile. Men who had left as proud soldiers came back to suspicion and resentment. Some were denounced as traitors for surviving captivity, while others had died in battle. Others were pressed into labor by the French or British before they could see their families again. And yet, among them, a quiet transformation had taken place. The men who had spent years in the United States carried more than memories. They carried ideas. They had witnessed democracy not as propaganda, but as daily routine. They had seen equality, law, and order functioning without terror or secret police. And those impressions, small as they seemed, began to echo in post-war Germany's rebuilding. Historians later called them the invisible ambassadors. Thousands of these former POWs went on to become teachers, engineers, and local officials in West Germany. Some joined new democratic parties, citing lessons learned in the camps of America. One former prisoner from Camp Algona wrote decades later, "In those years, I learned what dignity meant. They defeated us without hatred. But not everyone could reconcile the experience. A portion of the prisoners, especially those repatriated to the Soviet zone, found themselves re-imprisoned by Soviet authorities. Interrogations, suspicion, and forced labor continued their ordeal for years. To them, America's paradise became an almost mythical contrast, a memory whispered cautiously in the ruins of Dresden and Leipzig. For Americans, the legacy was complex. Many guards remembered the prisoners with unexpected fondness. Letters continued for decades, a trickle of correspondence across oceans, bridging former enemies through simple friendship. In Camp Swift, Texas, one guard and a former POW exchanged Christmas cards every year until the 1980s. "He was a good man," the guard's widow later said, "and so was the one he guarded." Meanwhile, U.S. historians, journalists, and veterans looked back at the POW system as a defining moral victory, not of combat, but of conscience. The contrast was stark. While other nations had used starvation or reprisal, America had chosen rules and restraint. This decision wasn't without its critics. Some argued the U.S. had been too generous, too soft, that kindness toward the enemy undermined justice. But the counter-argument carried greater weight. In a war defined by brutality, the POW camps had shown that civilization could survive even total war. The physical traces of those camps faded. Barracks dismantled, fences plowed under. Yet in many small towns, faint reminders endure. In Iowa, the Algona nativity scene still stands each Christmas, a monument not to victory, but to shared humanity. In Texas and Nebraska, museums display carvings, journals, and photographs, fragile testaments to the paradox of captivity and grace. For Germany, the experience became a moral mirror. In rebuilding the West German Army, NATO officers later studied the U.S. POW model, emphasizing professionalism and the rule of law. The lessons learned behind barbed wire quietly shaped post-war military ethics, and for the prisoners themselves, now old men, memories of that unlikely paradise followed them to their final days. Many spoke of the coffee, the order, the absence of hate. A few even returned to visit the sites, walking across open fields where guard towers once stood. They came not to relive the past, but to touch the ground where they first discovered that mercy could exist in war. The American experiment in humanity had left its mark, not in monuments or medals, but in the hearts of those who once called their captivity a paradise in hell. In the grand, violent theater of World War II, the story of the German POWs in America stands as one of the war's quietest contradictions. No heroics, no battles, just order, fences, and the radical notion that mercy could coexist with war. While Europe burned, America built cages of discipline and decency. Within them, nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers discovered something their own empire had denied them: structure without cruelty, power without terror, and dignity even in defeat. It was not compassion alone that created this paradox. It was calculation, law and faith in a moral system tested by fire. The Geneva Convention gave it shape, American abundance gave it form, and human conscience gave it soul. For the U.S., it became a victory of principle, proof that civilization need not vanish in total war. For the Germans who lived through it, it became a lesson far deeper than ideology, that freedom begins where fear ends. Behind every story of a camp orchestra, a Christmas carving, or a shared cigarette between guard and prisoner lies a truth about human endurance. That kindness, even when strategic, has the power to transform both the giver and the captive. When the last of those men sailed home, they carried no weapons, no medals, and no flag. But many carried an invisible inheritance, the memory of an enemy who treated them as men. Decades later, as Germany rose from the ruins and rebuilt itself into a democracy, echoes of that memory remained. In classrooms, in public service, in the quiet conviction that order without hatred is possible. The war that had begun in darkness ended, for some, in revelation. In the most unlikely of places, inside the barbed wire paradise of America, humanity had managed to survive its own destruction. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe to join our journey through the forgotten corners of World War II, where strategy, sacrifice, and the human spirit still echo. Like the video if you believe history's quietest stories deserve to be heard. Share it with someone who thinks war is only about battles, and show them what humanity looks like behind the wire. Comment below. Mercy in war is still strength. Let's see how many still believe that.